Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on Doordarshan, India's national television channel about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations and key developments in important countries and regions of the world that have a bearing on India's rise. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking a close look at the sharp economic slowdown in the world's second largest economy and second great power, China. What are the strategic implications of China's slowdown? Why is China not able to reverse its slowdown? And what will this do to China's behavior in the world? This is the focus of today's show. And to discuss this, let me introduce you to a domain expert who is joining us in the studio today, a very eminent sinologist, Professor Jabin Jacob.
Thank you, Sreeram. Good to be here.
Professor Jacob teaches at Nadar University, a prominent university in the National Capital Region of Delhi, and is the author of multiple papers and books on China's domestic and international relations. Great to have you on the show.
Pleasure.
Jabin, China's slowdown is not a new development, and it's been ongoing for the last decade or even longer. President Xi Jinping has called it the new normal when compared to double-digit growth and breakneck speed which used to be associated with China. It has slowed down quite a bit, but lately it looks like initially it was a high speed to medium speed, now medium speed to low speed, and it looks like going forward China is probably not going to notch up anything more than 3 or 4 percentage points in GDP per year. So if you would like to please start by talking about why this slowdown is happening, what's the structural reason, and why the Chinese are not able to stop this, seeming race to the bottom.
Well, first and foremost, we have to understand the nature of the Chinese state. It's a party state in which the Communist Party seeks to control all aspects of political life, but also all aspects of economic life. So, there have been several consequences to what you described as China's breakneck growth over several decades. And by the time Xi Jinping came appeared on the scene or was ready to take power, I think there was an elite level consensus within the Chinese party system that this kind of growth wasn't actually achieving everything it needed to for China. There was a great deal of inequality that had happened, there was pollution. There was also a certain degree of loss of control of the central government over the peripheries, over provinces, over localities. And the reason the party system sort of found was because growth was uncontrolled or growth was accelerating without paying attention to the consequences. So in many ways, the objective for the Chinese party state has actually been to slow growth down. There's been a deliberate attempt to slow growth down in order to regain control over certain levers of the economy. But there's also an ideological element in which the party wanted to assert itself as the dominant player, as the driving force of all aspects of Chinese life. And when the private sector grew and interactions of the private sector as well as of Chinese citizens with the outside world grew, these are all seen as somehow threatening the party's legitimacy or hold on power. And of course, party's legitimacy is also threatened when there is rising inequality and when there is pollution and so on. So what the Communist Party under Xi Jinping has done is try and control this growth. But of course, this is an authoritarian state. It does not have access to all information. Feedback mechanism or the feedback loop is quite weak. And so in many ways, it has overcorrected. Some of its measures have actually led to a dampening of what we call the animal spirits of the Chinese economy. So for example, the targeting of the private sector. This is partly ideological. The Chinese state wants state-owned enterprises to play the dominant role. But in what has also resulted is a weakening of the willingness to take initiative, the willingness to take risks.
Free enterprise.
The enterprising spirit has sort of been dampened. So while the growth rates have been sort of set as 5%, 6%. I mean, it's fallen much beyond, much further below than what the party actually wanted. And so now it seems to be in some sort of in a morass where there is very low consumption, there is very low confidence in the economy. Many Chinese companies are actually sort of, the stock prices have fallen so much that they are now actually being thrown off the stock exchange. by automatic processes. So some of these things have.
And Jabin, there's been a lot of focus on the property sector, real estate.
Yeah.
At one point, apparently, it contributed to almost 25% of China's GDP.
Right.
And the crash in the property market, the prices, these seems to have driven a lot of the, and that's linked to the debt
Yes.
of local governments and
Yeah.
all. So public finances and the real estate seem to be the real drag down, like they have been mismanaged, it seems, and the party has not been able to, despite its command over the economy, have not been able to rein in these excesses. And I mean, it's maybe the system from the American economy is totally different, but if you remember the subprime mortgages and those crises, those sound a bit like this Evergrande and all these Chinese property bubbles that are also bursting. So there's a lot of speculation, and it looks like they are not really in control, isn't it? And they're not able to channel finances the way they want to.
Yeah, I mean, again, the origins of this problem lie in the mid-90s when the Chinese central government tried to regain control over taxes and so on. So it created a new tax system in which the central government would do most of the collecting of taxes and then send revenue down the chain. But what happened was the provincial governments or the local governments were still left with the responsibility for social spending. And the one thing that these local governments had was control over land. And so speculation rose because that was a source of funds for many of these governments. And so that's how the real estate and the property market started booming. And then, of course, there's a nexus of corruption and so on, all of that went on. So now we have the situation, as you said, the economy has been driven by speculation in the property markets, and now that's again something that the Xi Jinping government consciously decided to target. And they were willing to take the losses. They were willing for companies to go bust and to sort of damp. And Xi Jinping has in fact several times said that houses are for living in, not for speculating. Now that's as clear as a message that he can actually send. But when these sort of measures are telescoped in such a short time frame, the economy has no time to adjust. So there will be consequences. And a lot of middle class investors have their savings tied up in the housing market. And often these were for investment purposes. But the prices are falling, and so now nobody's got the money, or money is tied up. Many property developers are not able to finish houses. And so people are protesting, or people are unhappy, or people are now unwilling to spend. They are trying to, shore up their savings. But the Chinese government has also wanted to reduce its dependence on the external world, and so wants to reorient its economy towards domestic consumption. But domestic consumption cannot grow if
this is what they call dual circulation.
Dual circulation. So this will not grow if there are these problems in the housing market.
Consumers have no self-confidence to spend.
Exactly.
Yeah. And you already mentioned dissent and dissatisfaction, Jabin. You study the domestic politics of China as well. There have been protests now and then, sporadic on different issues. The most dramatic ones were when the zero COVID harsh restrictions, 2022, we saw the so-called white paper revolt and all these things across China by young people coming out on streets holding those blank sheets of paper. And it looks like the youth unemployment is also relatively quite high compared to last few decades. It even crossed 25% at some point, and then they suppress the numbers or something like that. So if you look at the stability, I mean, you were saying that on one hand the party itself wanted to slow down the uncontrolled growth, but on the other hand, when growth is low and then there is a lot of repression, which is under Xi Jinping, the surveillance and the repression is tremendous. Isn't that like the pressure building for the lid to blow off? And what do you think is going to happen with this low growth now? If the new normal is going to be 3 or 4%, the party is not obviously delivering on its promise of continued economic prosperity and upward mobility for middle classes. So then what do you think is the likely impact on the society and on the politics and the state-society relations in a very highly centralized and authoritarian system? You assume the state is in control, but is it?
Well, I would say that the Chinese system is far more stronger and resilient than other authoritarian systems. And often I think the mistake we make is to judge China according to the standards that our own standards or Western standards. But that's not how the Chinese leadership thinks. And to an extent, given the sort of prevalence of propaganda or state control over education and information, that's also sort of the narrative that sort of goes on inside the Chinese territory or among the Chinese population as well. Having said that, there are constant attempts to sort of let off the pressure, to calibrate and so on. So it's not the case that protests don't take place at all in China. There are protests that happen frequently, but they are on certain issues. For example, the central government is very okay with people protesting against local mismanagement, local authorities, because that's a way in which the central government can come in and sort of save the day and look good, right? It also gives the impression that the central government is answerable to the people, accountable, and conscious or cognizant of what is going on at the ground level. But there is also this problem that the local governments have their own incentives to sort of deny information or control information flow. So there is that sort of keeps going on. So the Communist Party has sort of attempted to manage this by mid-career training, constant reshuffling of party officials. There's anti-corruption campaign. I mean, this is an extremely popular campaign, and one cannot deny that in many ways the anti-corruption campaign has succeeded. So there is, and because China is growing, China's international image is so strong or high, there is a degree of acceptance within the Chinese population saying, okay, you know what, we have achieved a great deal, we will have to take some on the chin and sort of move on. But the other issues, for example, environmental issues. Again, the party is very conscious about ecological issues. I mean, Xi Jinping has come up with this concept of ecological civilization. So again, environmental area issues are one in which protests are allowed and the party wants to correct. But by and large, I would say the white paper protest was something of an exception. It came under a particular set of circumstances where everybody is sort of locked down, and but the internet is still on, and people were getting tired of this zero COVID policy, and they were aware that rest of the world had opened up post COVID, but it was China that was still under lockdown. So there was kind of a response. And you see that the government responded immediately. Overnight, zero COVID was abandoned. And as soon as that was done, the people sort of went back to normal. So I think, we have to take into account that this is a very nimble authoritarian system that is very responsive, very quick to act, and very quick to change course if necessary.
Yeah, the flexibility has always probably upheld the Communist Party's success, right? I mean, there's compared to, for example, the Soviet Communist Party or elsewhere.
In fact, that's an example that they study very closely, and there are constant references to the Soviet example as something that the Chinese will not repeat.
Right. Yeah, they study it, right? They study it very closely. Now, Jabin, so you have this slowdown, and the real question now is, what does that do to China's role in the world? Let's start with the big picture as to the overall foreign policy approach. We have seen a much more aggressive and expansionist China in the last 10-12 years under Xi Jinping, and that happened while the gradual slowdown was happening. Now the real question is, what does low economic growth do, and is there a correlation to foreign policy approach and total overall outlook? Or to put it crudely, will it make China fiercer, or will it make China moderate and think twice about the risks and the costs of going on the confrontational path with neighbors, with the US, with the with everybody who they see as adversaries? They've been pressing the accelerator, right? So now with the slower growth, will we see a humbler China, or do you think, reading Xi Jinping and his method and his approach, could it be the other way around, where actually they try to increase the tempo, because that's probably one of the classic authoritarian playbook is to blame the foreigners and the external forces and say that they are responsible for they're trying to hem us in or to prevent our rise, which they often say themselves, the Communist Party. So which way do you see the overall approach going, based on this slowdown, compared to say 10 years ago when numbers were healthier and they were more integrated with the Western world? Looks like I see more collision and confrontation happening. What's your reading of the situation?
So I would say both of what you describe are happening. The Chinese are, but it depends on the context, the timing, and who it is that is the adversary or challenger at that point in time. For a long time, China was willing to do business with India because they thought that they could, convince India to stay neutral. Today, I think they have for whatever reason, they have decided that India is not an independent actor as such, that India functions in alignment with the West. They are not willing to buy whatever we say in terms of strategic autonomy, or essentially it's a way of looking at India. And it has to do with their ideological concerns at home. For them, it's a much more easier way of looking at the world if it's just black and white. If it's just China versus the United States. So everybody who sort of opposes China or disagrees with China is in the US camp. At the same time, the Chinese are cognizant of the global south. They are very concerned about the votes that the global south brings. They are very interested in convincing developing world that China has an alternative model to offer to the West. So there is a great deal of diplomacy, both your traditional foreign policy diplomacy, development aid, military diplomacy, all of that is happening with the developing world. And you see that happening also in India's own neighborhood, right? How China deals with India's neighbors is very different from how China deals with India. So I would say both China can be both aggressive as well as sort of decide to take it easy or go slow with certain neighbors and try and convince certain small countries that, look, your best interests are served by aligning with us. But of course, they have to send signals also to these countries. For example, if India is the dominant power in South Asia, China will always try and play up India's faults or India's weaknesses and convince India's neighbors that they are better off doing business with the Chinese. Elsewhere in the world, say in Africa, the Chinese compete by no conditions asked or no strings attached development aid. And so in many ways, the Western democracies, India, might have left the door open for Chinese to come into their sort of traditional spheres of influence by our own set of actions, by not being humble, as you said, or considerate about the concerns of these smaller countries, by not giving them alternatives. And I wouldn't say that we should not stand true with our values, but moralizing and preaching without showing action on the ground or effect on the ground is also...
There was a gap with the implementation of projects. And
exactly.
All that. Yeah. No, but Jabin, what about the core adversaries? I mean, the US and to a lesser extent Europe. I mean, China has wanted technology, wanted investment from these countries, but with the trade wars, which started with Trump's first administration, and it's looking likely there may be another Trump administration in the US. The trade wars are going to intensify. The technology restrictions and export controls that came under Biden seem like they are going to continue. So what do you think? I mean, that and the Chinese have been saying that the US is committing a crime and denying our right to develop by blocking off all these things, and this is against World Trade Organization rules and all these things. So clearly the Chinese are also feeling the pinch of the denial regimes that the Western countries are now put in place, right? And I think Xi Jinping has also spoken about how it's going to be a far difficult climb from now onwards because of the resistance and the blockage coming from the West. So my reading is like as China slows down, they don't have alternative access to high tech, components and parts and all these things, right? So what is that going to do to their growth and also to the approach to Western countries? I mean, already US-China friction is growing as we talk. Do you see that getting a lot worse, or do you think the Chinese will maybe tactically accommodate some Western interests? Because the way they've been, trying to pressurize Taiwan and the Philippines and other Western allies, I think that seems to be counterproductive from the point of view of a slowing economy, right? But maybe they're not thinking that way.
Exactly. I mean, I think the way they look at these actions is very different from our approach. because we think that this doesn't make any sense. But for them, politically, it makes a great deal of sense. And it's about China's place in Asia, so they need to signal to the Philippines or Japan or Taiwan who the, the big boy in the room is. So it's very important that they continue to put pressure on these small countries. But it's also, the idea is to tell them, like, look, we are not going anywhere, we will continue to put pressure, and the Americans are not going to be able to come to your aid. And therefore, rethink your approaches. So it's an attempt to break the alliance system, the American alliance system in these countries. But what you said about the impact of sanctions on China's economic growth, I mean, this is absolutely true. But the Chinese have also been, by their very nature, by the nature of the party state, they've also been preparing for this for a very long time. So I don't think that these sanctions and these restrictions on chips, etc., are going to be effective for very long. I mean, over time, the Chinese have put in a lot of money into R&D, and they will do both things. They will both confront, but also, as you said, engage in tactical measures. They will try and continue to buy up, Western companies. I mean, the Western capital system itself lends itself, to acquisition by others, right? So it requires a great deal of attention, vetting, and on the Western side to be able to prevent all of this happening.
Using national security grounds and all.
And it's often going to be contested even within the West, because there is money involved, there are jobs involved.
Like we saw with the ban on TikTok, there are a lot of American, private players and consumers who are supporting TikTok, even though the establishment wanted to ban it. Yeah,
because there's money involved, and of course, in the American system and the Western system, lobbies are also allowed. So the Chinese can very well, lobby. So all of that is happening, but the Chinese are also prepared. I mean, it will take some time now that attention is focused on China for them to sort of get back up to speed. But I think they are pretty much on track. It might slow down, but I don't think we should work under the assumption that the Chinese have been completely stymied or prevented from getting there. I think we need to be very careful in making these large assumptions about Chinese weakness. I mean, China is it's got scale. I know what you say about too big to fail. It's quite important. I mean, for example, the BRI. You could say that the BRI is affected by China's economic weakness, etc. But the Chinese were never sort of expecting BRI to succeed everywhere. All it needs is a few high visibility successes and foot in the door in many of these countries, and it's got
which they have got over the last decade. But Jabin, what about investment? I mean, over the years, Western investment has poured in trillions into China, and so now that is drying up and it's come to record low levels. Do they have the resources to keep on humming the economy? Because it was an FDI driven rise, right? Now the FDI is not coming into China. So what's going to happen on that front, and do they have a plan for that, or is this going to now continue to decelerate the economy?
No, I think, unlike the Americans, the Chinese still have a sort of a view of the world in which they are integral players. I mean, being integrated into the world economy is very much part of the Chinese growth story, and they understand it. What they are sort of careful about is over-dependence on the West, because they perceive the West as an ideological adversary. But Chinese investment is actually flowing into Southeast Asia, into Africa. So outward investment, right? So it's not only about inward investment. The Chinese now have scale. Chinese companies have scale. They are moving from lower end technologies and industries to higher end technologies and industries. They are actually expanding in many ways. I mean, the Belt and Road has now sort of diversified into what you call this global development initiative, security initiative, civilization initiative. So they are doing multiple things at the same time. Not everything needs to succeed, but because they have so many balls up in the air at the same time, a lot is actually happening. And
some will fail.
Some will fail, and they are ready for it. But quite a lot of it might also succeed.
Right. Jabin, last word from the Indian point of view. People often ask this with the case of Pakistan, a much weaker adversary. If it's collapsing, if it is failing, if it is slowing down, is it more dangerous to India or less dangerous to India? Same question for our main adversary. If it is slowing down, do you think they'll be more reasonable towards us on border dispute, on competition in the region, or do you think that that will continue nevertheless, because they perceive India as the main obstacle for their dominance in Asia, so they will continue to put pressure on us? Should we be quietly applauding China's economic slowdown in the sense, or should we be worried about it?
I think we should be worried about it because in many ways our growth story is also tied to some of these same processes that are responsible for China's rise. And you have to admit that it is because what China did what they did that we have also managed the telecom revolution in India, right? People often complain about the trade deficit, but the trade deficit is only with China. Overall balance of trade is what we should be worried about. So at the same time, as you point out, the Chinese will continue to look at India as an obstacle. So we have to understand that that is going to continue. But it's not as if the Chinese hold all the cards. We can also decide for ourselves by our own actions how we can make the most of it. If China is under pressure from the Americans and the Europeans, how can we take advantage of it, right? So it's not just that we are sitting back and letting things happen. We also need to be proactive in shaping the circumstances. So whether it's on the LAC or in the Indian Ocean or in the economic relationship, I think India can and must do much more than it has been doing in order to change and shape the situation to our advantage.
Right. So incentives and disincentives matter always. Viewers, Professor Jabin Jacob is saying that there's a lot that India can do actually to shape the neighbor and its behavior the way we would prefer it to be. So it's not like we are just recipients of Chinese actions or passively looking at it. But the bigger takeaway from this discussion is that China is slowing down, and it has lots of vulnerabilities and weaknesses, but it also has accumulated strengths over decades, and those will not vanish overnight or dissipate. So we should be under no illusion that because of the economic slowdown that China is going to collapse, or that the regime will fall, or that it's going to become very weak. So there's very much a case for us to watch this trend of Chinese deceleration. India is catching up. India is growing much faster than China, and so over the next decade maybe we will close the gap, also the power gap with them. But there are also reasons to be concerned about China's economic slowdown from different viewpoints. So let me thank Professor Jabin Jacob for always erudite thinking and deep insights. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Sreeram. Been a pleasure. Thank you.
So viewers, Chinese slowdown is the new normal, is the fact of life. We may see China coming down to on average 3% growth per year as per many neutral predictions. And no matter what the state tries or does, there are some things which are structural and inbuilt to the Chinese model, to the authoritarian state, the political economy of the authoritarian state, and which will not allow it to go back to the halcyon days of double-digit growth. That is over, but China is a great power and it remains one, and we will have to contend and reckon with it. Do follow the Chinese economic story closely. It has a direct bearing on India's rise. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.